In topic 5.2, we will look at the different types of terrestrial food production systems and why we make the food choices we do. Looking at this map from 2015, this is a hunger map and it shows the areas of the world and it's predicted out to 2016 of where undernourishment is a problem. Now, undernourishment means you're not getting enough calories. Malnourishment means you're not getting enough nutrients. And overnourished means you're getting too many calories. We have more of a problem of overnourishment in the US than we do undernourishment. One of the global goals to achieve sustainable development by 2030 is to end hunger. There's a short video clip I also included on today's module that explains these goals. So the problem is that 1 in 9 people suffer from chronic undernourishment, meaning they're not getting enough calories, and another big issue is they're not getting enough protein. Of those, 1 in 3 suffer some sort of malnutrition, so not getting enough nutrients. One of the reasons that we have higher infant mortality rate in some of our less economically developed countries is because of poor nutrition. 10.9 million child deaths each year can be attributed to poor nutrition. We do produce enough food worldwide to feed everyone on Earth. The problem is with distribution. A lack of transportation or access to land and water or money to distribute can create shortages in some areas and excess in others. Poverty, conflict, and climate change can also contribute as well. There are inequalities in food distribution and also food production. Our more economically developed countries tend to produce too much food, which creates artificially low prices. We also have import tariffs, which makes importing foods more expensive. So in less economically developed countries where they depend on their exports and their cash crops, they're losing some of that ability to sell when our imports are more expensive. Oftentimes, they concentrate on cash crops as well and aren't feeding the local populations. Other inequalities have to do with how we use the grains that we grow. If we eat more meat or we are growing more of our crops for biofuel, like corn used for ethanol and gas, then our prices are going to go up because the land is not just being used for food crops, but also as grain and for biofuels. Climate change can lead to crop loss. Also, another inequality is how our farms are run. More economically developed countries are more technocentric and have more industrial farms, whereas the less economically developed countries are more labor intensive, usually from within the families that live on the land. As far as food waste goes, there's waste in both the more economically and less economically developed countries, but for different reasons. We tend to waste because we buy more food than we need, which means it goes bad before we can eat it. Supermarkets have certain standards, like they want to sell round apples or red strawberries. So misshapen foods or foods that aren't quite the right color tend to get thrown away. In less economically developed countries, because they don't have the necessary refrigeration or the infrastructure to transport the produce, they tend to have more food spoilage, also more pest infestations. They don't have the canning factories to preserve the foods that we do. Now, as far as choosing a food production system, there's many factors that come into play. One is socioeconomics. The lower income groups tend to have a tendency to consume unbalanced diets with less fruits and vegetables. They're going to eat more processed foods because it is less expensive than it is to buy the fresh produce. There are cultural and religious influences. Some religions don't eat beef, some don't eat pork, some are strictly vegetarian. Ecological reasons, there has to be arable land present. Also, we want to produce food while at the same time maintaining biodiversity and ecosystems. Climate determines whether we need to irrigate or we need to have greenhouses to have food year-round. There are subsidies and tariffs in place that affect the price of foods. And then economic influences, supply and demand, and what is affordable. Again, comparing more economically and less economically developed countries, our food prices tend to be relatively low because of the amount of food that we produce. We have a surplus, and also because of subsidies in place where money is given to farmers to grow certain crops, which artificially lowers the price. Our food choices tend to be based on our preference for taste rather than nutritional need. We also have technology and transportation system in place, which allows us to import food and to produce food year-round. Whereas our less economically developed countries cannot produce enough food for their population. Part of it's because they're exporting some of their crops for profit instead of the local communities. There are also environmental limits on what foods can be grown, and their food choice is not necessarily based on taste and what they want, but seasonal availability. In more economically developed countries, we tend to intake more calories per day. Higher percentage of that is from meat and fish over the cereal grains, whereas in less economically developed country, they tend to eat lower on the food chain. All right, looking at different types of farming systems, subsistence farming is where you produce enough food for your family. You're not producing a surplus. You're depending solely on human and animal labor. You tend to grow mixed crops because you're growing everything that you need for your family. There are very low inputs of energy, though in some cases there is cash cropping where you're selling excess for profit. Commercial farming is solely production for profit. The idea is that you want to maximize your crop yield per unit arable land. It uses a high level of technology. It's typically monoculture where there is one crop grown. There's high inputs of energy. There's both extensive and intensive commercial farming. Extensive meaning there's more land with lower planting depending on the crop. Intensive, there's more land used more intensively, so it's high input and output. Inputs would be irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, energy, but then that would result in a higher output in terms of food production. Other farming systems, pastoral farming is where you raise animals on grass and land not suitable for crops, so that's your grazing animals. Arable farming is growing crops to eat directly or for grain for the animals. And then mixed farming is a combination of crops and animals. So typically the animal waste would be used to fertilize the crops, but also crops are used to feed the animals. In the picture here at the bottom, this is growing rice. But ducks are also there, and their waste goes to fertilize the rice. There are also rice plantations that have carp or other fish that live in the water, and the fish can be harvested for food, and the fish waste goes to fertilize the rice as well. Worldwide, the availability of land for food production per person or per capita has decreased. Part of that's because of human population growth, but it's also due to urbanization and then degradation of what soil resources we have. Examples of degradation would be soil erosion, salinization from irrigation, urbanization, and desertification, which usually is caused by overgrazing. If we eat at lower trophic levels, more people on Earth could be supported using our arable land, and that's because it takes less energy because only 10% of the energy is passed from one trophic level to the next. So if we eat the primary producers, then it's going to be much more efficient than if we eat beef or pork or anything that's at that first trophic level. It's also less expensive if we eat on the lower trophic levels as well, and will require fewer resources overall. If we're eating at lower trophic levels, we're not raising the grain to feed the animals. If we don't have the animals, that's going to reduce the amount of overgrazing, which in turn would reduce desertification. More people would receive an adequate diet, and of course we would also be using less fuel energy, so less carbon dioxide emissions. When we eat at higher trophic levels, we do get more protein in our diet, and a lot of times we choose to eat at higher trophic levels because of the taste, but it also tends to be more available in our more economically developed countries. If we look at this graph, it shows the energy required to produce 1 pound. And this is in kilowatt hours per pound. You see beef is significantly higher than our other protein sources, which are also in turn significantly higher than our primary sources like corn. This is just another comparison, what can be produced on 1 hectare of land. So 12,000 steaks, which is about 0.3 tons of beef, compared to 7.5 tons of wheat grain, which would be about 11,000 and a half loaves of bread. Now, the sustainability of our terrestrial food production systems is influenced by multiple factors. The choices of food, what's available in terms of fertilizers, pest control, legislation, and then whether or not we are producing more food for our commercial farms or subsistence food production. In order to achieve sustainability, we need to maximize our yield of food production. The Green Revolution helped us do that by improving our technology with as far as fertilizer use, pesticides. We started using monoculture, but actually to improve sustainability, switching to polyculture where you're mixing your crops on the field. This helps conserve water and soil because you have vegetation covering the soil year-round. So you're avoiding the plowing and tilling, which can lead to erosion. Using drip irrigation also helps prevent runoff because the water is going directly to the roots and you're not losing the water to evaporation. Also cuts down on salinization of the soil. Using GMOs can help increase food production yield. They are controversial. However, we have crops that can withstand drought. We have crops that produce their own pesticide that's harmless to humans. They can be harvested in a shorter amount of time, so we can have multiple harvests per year. Another thing that we can do is to rotate our crops, and that helps with fertilizer and erosion as well. If we alter human activity, like reducing our meat consumption, as we said, eating lower on the trophic levels, if we eat more organically grown and locally produced food products, that cuts down on our commercial farming as well. Improving the accuracy of food labels to help consumers make informed food choices would also help us to achieve increased sustainability. But that's going to require governmental and intergovernmental bodies to regulate the standards and practices and also imports and exports. And that is it.